Hands where I can see them. He grabbed my wrist before I could speak. My gardening glove hit the pavement. "This is my house," I said. He didn't look at the address. He looked at my clothes and decided I was lying. He shoved my shoulder toward his cruiser. My hand instinctively reached for my wrist, for the watch that never left my skin. Somewhere behind the hedge, a phone was already recording. He hadn't noticed yet. He had no idea what that watch meant. A second cruiser pulled up. 2 more officers stepped out, unsure whether to intervene or back their colleague blindly. "Sir, she says this is her address," one of them said quietly. Sawyer didn't even turn his head. My neighbor Ruth stepped onto her porch, phone already up, voice shaking but certain. "I know her. That's Dorothy." Sawyer didn't care. "Ma'am, step back," he told her. He was already deciding how this report would read. The watch on my wrist had survived a funeral, 2 moves, and 11 years. It had never survived being called a lie. "Where's your husband?" Sawyer asked mockingly, seeing the watch. "Not going to answer for you today?" I didn't answer. Some questions aren't worth the breath it takes to correct them. My phone buzzed once in my cardigan pocket. He didn't hear it. I didn't reach for it yet. More neighbors gathered at the curb. Nobody moved to help. They only watched, the way people do when they're afraid to choose a side. A patrol supervisor's SUV turned onto the street. Sawyer straightened his posture, certain he'd done nothing wrong. A captain's insignia caught the morning light as he stepped out. He was here for something else entirely. He just didn't know it yet. "Sawyer," the captain called out, scanning the yard. "I need you at the gate. The new commissioner's touring the district this morning." Sawyer laughed, gesturing at me. "Little busy here, Captain. Trespasser wouldn't ID herself." The captain's eyes moved past Sawyer, landed on my face, and went completely still. "Commissioner Vance," the captain said, voice cracking. Every head on that street turned at once. Sawyer's face went the color of the pavement beneath him. He finally understood exactly what he had just done. "My name is Dorothy Vance." 6 hours before that morning, I had raised my right hand in a courthouse hallway and sworn an oath most people in this city would never know I'd taken until they saw it on the evening news. I hadn't told my new department yet. I hadn't told my neighbors. I hadn't even told the 2 officers who drove past my house twice that week without recognizing the woman they'd soon be reporting to. That had always been the plan. Before I accepted the job, I asked the mayor for one small, deliberate thing. 3 quiet weeks moving through this city exactly as I always had, unannounced, unescorted, dressed the way I dress on any ordinary Saturday. Gardening gloves. An old cardigan. No badge, no motorcade, no press release trailing behind me like a spotlight. I wanted to see this department the way an ordinary resident saw it, not the way it performed for someone who could end a career with a signature. I had learned a long time ago that titles change how people behave. I wanted the truth first. So on the morning Officer Brett Sawyer rolled slowly past my driveway, clocked a black woman in gardening clothes standing near a house he decided didn't belong to her, and radioed in a suspicious person before he'd even run my plate. He had no idea he was giving me exactly what 3 weeks of careful anonymity had been built to reveal. I watched him approach with that particular walk officers get when they've already written the report in their head before the encounter has even started. I watched him grab my wrist without asking a single verifying question. I watched 3 other officers arrive, and I watched every one of them hesitate just long enough to tell me something important about how this department actually operates when no camera crew is filming a press conference. I hadn't planned on being struck. Nobody plans for that. But when it happened, a shove hard enough to send me stumbling against my own porch railing, some old, steady part of me simply cataloged it. The way you catalog evidence when you've spent a career around courtrooms and internal affairs files. I noted the time. I noted his badge number, visible for half a second before he turned. I noted that not one of the 3 backup officers stepped in to stop him. My husband, Marcus, used to say that dignity isn't the absence of anger. It's what you do with the anger while everyone is watching to see if you'll lose it. He wore this watch for 18 years on patrol before it stopped for good on a highway shoulder answering a call that wasn't even his to take. I wear it now because it reminds me, every single day I put on this badge, exactly what the uniform is supposed to mean when it's worn correctly. Sawyer never asked whose driveway he was standing on. He was about to find out. Marcus and I met at a community safety forum 11 years ago. Both of us the youngest people in a room full of retired officers arguing about a policy neither of them had read all the way through. He raised his hand and asked one clean, precise question that cut through 40 minutes of noise in about 15 seconds. I remember thinking, that's a man who doesn't waste words. He didn't waste much of anything, actually. Not time, not patience with cruelty, not the trust people placed in him. He believed policing was supposed to be a promise, not a performance. That the badge only meant something if the person wearing it remembered every single day that the public hadn't handed over power, they'd loaned it, conditionally, and could take it back the moment it was abused. I built my career believing the same thing, just from a different chair. Deputy District Attorney for 6 years, specializing in cases against officers who forgot that loan existed. I won some. I lost more than I wanted to. Every loss taught me something about how institutions protect their own long after the public has stopped believing they deserve protecting. When Marcus died, I didn't retreat from any of it. I went further in. I told myself, in the numb weeks after the funeral, that the best way to honor a man who believed in doing this job right was to make sure fewer families ever had to learn what line of duty actually costs a family sitting at a kitchen table. The watch had been sitting in evidence for 11 days before they returned it to me. I've worn it every day since. Not as a wound I keep reopening, as a measurement. Every officer I've ever evaluated, every department I've ever audited, every reform I've ever pushed through a reluctant city council, I've measured against the version of the job Marcus actually lived, not the version departments like to put on recruiting posters. That's why I asked for 3 anonymous weeks before I ever sat behind the commissioner's desk. Because policy reviews and press conferences tell you what a department wants to be seen as. Only an ordinary Tuesday tells you what it actually is. I hadn't expected my own driveway to be the Tuesday that told me everything. But standing there with Sawyer's hand still tied around my wrist, I understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of morning this was about to become, for him, for the 3 officers standing silently behind him, and for a department that was about to learn its new commissioner had already seen precisely who they were before they ever knew she was watching. The captain's voice cracked when he said my name, and for a moment nobody on that street moved at all. Not the neighbors at the curb. Not the 2 backup officers who'd been standing a few feet from Sawyer this entire time. Not even the birds seemed to make noise in that particular silence. "Commissioner Vance," he said again, quieter this time, as if repeating it might change what had already happened. Sawyer's hand was still on my wrist. I watched him become aware of it slowly. The way you become aware of holding something dangerous only after someone points out what it actually is. He let go like it had burned him. He started, and then stopped, because there was no sentence that began with those words that was going to end anywhere good. I straightened my cardigan. I didn't rub my wrist, though it ached. I had learned a long time ago that the moment you nurse a wound in front of an audience, you hand them permission to focus on your pain instead of the choice that caused it. "Captain Reyes," I said, and I watched him flinch slightly at the sound of my voice using his name so calmly. I'd like Officer Sawyer's body camera footage pulled immediately, along with the dispatch call that sent him to my own driveway. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." He was already reaching for his radio. Ruth, my neighbor, still had her phone raised, though her hand was shaking now for an entirely different reason. Around us, more phones had come up, not to record a spectacle anymore, but because everyone standing on that street understood, in real time, that they were watching something that mattered. Sawyer's mouth opened again. "Ma'am, I didn't know. If I'd known who you—" "That's the problem," I said. My voice didn't rise. It never does. "You weren't supposed to know who I was. You were supposed to treat whoever was standing in this driveway with the same restraint either way." He had no response to that. There isn't one. I looked past him, toward the two backup officers who'd stood silently through the entire encounter. Names, I said simply. Not a threat. A request that both of them understood, immediately, was not optional. Behind me, my own front door had opened. My daughter Tanya stood on the porch, phone already to her ear, calling the one person in this scene who hadn't arrived yet, my chief of staff, who would have the full incident report open on a laptop within the hour. The morning had started with a man deciding, in under 10 seconds, exactly what kind of woman was standing in her own driveway. It was about to end very differently than he'd planned. Within 20 minutes, a black SUV I didn't recognize pulled up behind Captain Reyes's vehicle. My chief of staff, Marcus, no relation, an odd coincidence I'd stopped commenting on months ago, stepped out with a tablet already open, scrolling through the department's internal dispatch log. The call came in as a suspicious person, possible trespassing, he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Reported by a resident 3 houses down. Officer Sawyer responded without confirming an address match against the property owner on file, which would have taken him under a minute, I said. Yes, ma'am. Sawyer stood very still through all of this, the posture of a man realizing, piece by piece, exactly how thin his justification had been the entire time. His backup officers had already given their names to Captain Reyes, both of them careful, both of them suddenly extremely cooperative. Ruth walked over slowly, phone finally lowered, and pressed it into my chief of staff's hand without a word. He nodded his thanks and immediately began transferring the footage. Ma'am, Sawyer said again, and this time there was something almost desperate in it. I have a good record. 8 years, no complaints. 2 complaints, Captain Reyes corrected quietly, reading from his own device. Both closed without action. I'm reopening them this afternoon. I watched something in Sawyer's face fully collapse at that. Not the moment he grabbed my wrist. Not even the moment he learned my name. This, the sound of his own captain, in front of witnesses, undoing 8 years of assumed protection in a single sentence. I'm not interested in punishing you for being wrong about who I was. I told him, and I meant it. I'm interested in what you were willing to do to someone you assumed had no power to stop you. That's the only question that's ever mattered in this job. He didn't have an answer. There wasn't one that would have helped him. Captain Reyes turned to me, professional again, though his hands were still slightly unsteady. Commissioner, how would you like to proceed? I looked at the small crowd still gathered at my curb. Neighbors who had watched, some who had filmed, one woman who had said my name out loud when it mattered even before anyone believed her. I looked at the 3 officers standing in various states of quiet dread on my lawn. By the book, I said. Exactly the way it's supposed to work when the person standing in that driveway isn't me. Captain Reyes nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant. By noon, the footage had already made its way to the department's internal affairs office, and by early afternoon, a version of it, filmed from Ruth's porch, had been picked up by a local news outlet after someone in that small crowd, who I never did identify, sent it in without waiting to be asked. I hadn't wanted it to go public. Not for my own sake, for the department's, because I knew what was about to happen next, and I wanted it to happen because it was right, not because a city was watching. It happened anyway. That's how these things go now. Sawyer was placed on administrative leave that same afternoon, pending a formal internal investigation. His body camera footage, once pulled and reviewed frame by frame, showed exactly what I already knew it would. A stop initiated without cause, an escalation that ignored 2 verbal attempts I made to identify myself, and a physical use of force that, under the department's own use of force policy, should never have occurred against an unarmed, non-threatening individual regardless of who she turned out to be. That last part mattered more to me than almost anything else in the entire case file. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. The policy existed to protect everyone equally, and it had failed to do that for exactly as long as it took one officer to decide, on site, that I didn't belong on my own property. The 2 backup officers were placed under review as well, not for what they did, but for what they hadn't. Standing by silently while a colleague escalates unlawfully is its own kind of failure, and I made sure that got written into department policy within the month, not just applied to this one incident. Ruth called me that evening, apologizing, oddly, for filming without asking. I told her not to apologize for the one thing that morning that had actually helped. "I didn't know it was you," she said. "I just knew it was wrong." That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything Sawyer said that day. It was, I think, the entire point. Ruth didn't need to know my title to know an injustice when she saw one happening on her own street. That's the version of a community I've spent my whole career trying to build, a department worthy of standing inside. By the end of that first week in office, the story wasn't really about me anymore. It had become about every resident who'd ever had an encounter like mine and never had a badge, a watch, or a captain who happened to recognize their face at exactly the right moment. I intended to spend the rest of my term making sure that mattered a great deal less than it currently did. The internal affairs hearing took 11 days. I recused myself formally from the review process the moment the case was assigned, and asked an independent civilian oversight panel, the very kind of panel Sawyer's own union had spent years lobbying against, to handle every step instead. I wanted it done right more than I wanted it done fast. The panel reviewed the body camera footage, the dispatch recording, Ruth's video, and statements from both backup officers, who, once removed from the pressure of standing beside a superior colleague, offered a far more honest account than either of them had given on the driveway that morning. Both said, in nearly identical language, that they'd known within the first 30 seconds that Sawyer hadn't followed protocol. Both admitted they'd stayed silent out of habit, not agreement. That admission became one of the most important findings in the entire report. Not because it excused their silence. It didn't. But because it named, plainly, the exact culture I'd been brought into this office to change. An officer doesn't need every colleague to agree with a bad decision. He only needs enough of them willing to stay quiet while it happens. Sawyer's formal hearing took place on a Thursday morning I did not attend, by design. I didn't want my presence to turn a procedural matter into a spectacle centered on me. I read the transcript that evening instead, alone, in the quiet of my office, the watch resting against my wrist the entire time. He was terminated for cause, excessive force, failure to follow verification protocol, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The two backup officers received formal reprimands and mandatory retraining, along with a note in their permanent files that would follow them for the rest of their careers. None of it undid the 10 seconds it took him to grab my wrist. Nothing could. But it did something else, something I'd learned mattered just as much over years of watching institutions fail people quietly. It made the cost of that decision real, visible, and permanent, in exactly the kind of official record that used to disappear before anyone outside the department ever saw it. Captain Reyes came to my office the following week, uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "I should have asked more questions before I ever radioed him out to your street," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong, Captain," I told him. "You did something worse. You did what everyone in that department has always done. Nothing, until someone forced the question." He nodded slowly, and I watched him understand, the way I needed every officer under my command to eventually understand, that the absence of an obvious villain doesn't mean a system is working. Sometimes it just means no one has looked closely enough yet. 3 weeks after the hearing concluded, I stood in front of the entire patrol division for the first time as commissioner. Not anonymously, not in gardening clothes, but in full uniform, in the department's main briefing hall, in front of every officer who would be reporting to me for the length of my term. I didn't mention my own driveway by name. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew. I spent 3 weeks moving through this city the way any resident does, I told them. Not because I don't trust this department. Because I needed to understand it honestly before I asked any of you to trust me. I watched several officers shift in their seats. Not out of guilt, necessarily. Most of them had done nothing wrong. But because they understood, in that moment, that the department they'd joined was now being led by someone who had personally experienced exactly what it feels like to be on the other side of a badge when procedure fails. What happened on my street 3 weeks ago wasn't unique to me, I continued. It happens every week, in this city. To people who don't have a captain who recognizes their face and a chief of staff who can pull a dispatch log within the hour. That's the version of this job I'm interested in fixing. Not the version that only works correctly when the person standing in the driveway happens to be someone powerful enough to survive the mistake. I announced 3 policy changes that morning. Mandatory 2-officer address verification before any residential stop is escalated. A revised duty to intervene standard with real consequences attached, and an independent civilian review requirement for every use of force incident, regardless of outcome. None of it would have existed, at least not this quickly, if a man named Brett Sawyer hadn't decided, on an ordinary Saturday morning, that a woman in a gray cardigan couldn't possibly belong in the driveway she was standing in. I don't think about him with anger anymore. I think about him the way I think about every flawed system that produces a moment like that one, as a symptom, not a singular cause. Firing him mattered. It was necessary, but it was never going to be the whole answer, and I refused to let this department treat it like one. After the briefing, Ruth sent me a text. Just 3 words, proud of you. I hadn't told her yet that the first policy I signed that morning had her name quietly attached to the acknowledgments. A small, procedural nod that would never make the news, but that I wanted on record all the same. Some doors don't need to be slammed to matter. Some just need to finally, properly, open. The lawsuit settlement, when it came, wasn't mine to negotiate. I'd recused myself from that too, letting the city attorney's office and my own legal counsel handle it entirely at arm's length. I read about the final terms in a memo like everyone else on my staff. A formal public apology from the department, a policy commitment published for public review, and a settlement amount directed, at my request, toward a community fund for civilian oversight training rather than into my own hands. I didn't want the money. I wanted the record. Sawyer's termination became part of the department's public accountability report that year, one line among several, stripped of my name, listed only by case number and outcome. That was intentional too. I never wanted this story to become about vindicating me. I wanted it to become policy, something boring, procedural, and permanent, the kind of change that outlives news cycles and public attention spans entirely. Captain Reyes retired 8 months later, earlier than planned, telling me privately that the driveway had taught him something about his own 30-year career that he wasn't proud to have needed a lesson in this late. I didn't try to talk him out of it. Some people need to leave a system to finally see it clearly. Ruth still waters her lawn every morning at the same hour. Some mornings, when I'm not buried under budget hearings or officer review boards, I walk over and help her, the way I used to before any of this happened, before either of us had any idea her front porch would end up matching to a city she'd lived in quietly for 30 years. She never brings up the video unless I do first. I appreciate that about her more than she probably knows. The watch still doesn't leave my wrist. It never will. Not because I need reminding of what happened in my own driveway. That morning replays itself often enough on its own, but because of what it reminded me of before any of this started, that the job only means something if it's done the same way whether or not anyone important is watching. Marcus used to say that dignity isn't the absence of anger. It's what you choose to build with it once the anger has told you exactly what needs fixing. I think, most days, I've finally started building it. A year after that morning, the department released its first independent oversight report under the new policies, the one built directly from what happened in my own driveway, though the report itself never used my name. It didn't need to. Everyone who worked inside that building understood exactly where the language had come from. Use of force complaints involving residential stops had dropped by nearly a third. Not because officers had become more cautious out of fear. I never wanted a department that policed itself out of fear, but because the mandatory verification step gave good officers, the vast majority of them, a built-in moment to slow down before assumption turned into action. I brought a printed copy of that report to Ruth's porch one Saturday morning. The same porch where she'd first raised her phone a year earlier. She read the summary page slowly, glasses pushed up on her nose, and looked up at me with an expression I hadn't quite seen from her before. "You did this," she said. We did this, I corrected her. You said my name out loud before you knew it would matter. That's the part of that morning I think about the most. She waved that off, embarrassed, the way people who've done something genuinely important often are. I let her wave it off. Some people need permission not to feel like a hero for doing the obvious right thing. I never saw Brett Sawyer again after his hearing, not directly. I heard, secondhand, that he'd moved out of state, taken a job in private security. I hope, honestly, that whatever he does next, he carries something useful out of that morning with him. Not shame for its own sake, but the specific, uncomfortable clarity of having been shown exactly what he was capable of when he assumed no one who mattered was watching. I don't know if he has. That was never really my responsibility to manage. My responsibility was the system that let it happen as easily as it did, and I've spent every day since making sure that system answers a very different set of instincts than the ones it operated on that morning. The two backup officers, after their retraining, both remained on the force. One of them, months later, stopped a colleague mid-escalation on a call that could have gone the exact same way mine did. He wrote it up himself, unprompted, and flagged it for review before anyone asked him to. I read that report twice before filing it. It was, without question, the best morning I'd had in that office in a very long time. People still ask me sometimes, in interviews or community forums, whether I regret spending those 3 anonymous weeks before taking office, whether, knowing what happened in my own driveway, I would have skipped straight to the desk, the badge, the visible authority that might have prevented that morning from happening to me at all. I always tell them the same thing. If I'd walked into this job with an escort and a press conference, I would have learned exactly what this department wanted me to see. I would never have learned what Sawyer actually believed about who deserved patience and who didn't, because he would have performed differently for a commissioner than he performed for a woman in a gray cardigan he assumed had no power to stop him. That performance gap is the entire problem. It's the reason oversight fails in institutions all over this country, because the people with the authority to fix a system rarely see it the way the people living inside it actually experience it. My driveway wasn't an accident of bad luck. It was, in a strange and painful way, the most useful thing that happened to me in my first year in office, because it told me the truth before anyone had a chance to dress it up for my benefit. I don't say that lightly. Being struck in front of my own home by someone sworn to protect this city is not an experience I would wish on anyone, including myself. But I've spent enough of my career watching institutions protect their comfortable version of themselves to know that comfort and accountability rarely coexist for long. Marcus used to say the job only means something if it's done the same way whether or not anyone important is watching. That morning, standing in my driveway with a glove on the pavement and a stranger's hand around my wrist, nobody watching me yet knew who I was. That was exactly the point. And when the truth finally did arrive, carried not by a badge or a title, but by a captain's cracking voice and a neighbor who filmed before she ever knew it would matter, it didn't just change one officer's career. It changed how an entire department understood what it means to serve a city honestly, in the quiet moments no one important is supposed to be watching at all. The city council formally adopted the full oversight package 18 months after that Saturday morning, unanimously, after a public hearing that ran nearly 4 hours. I sat through all of it, listening more than speaking, because by that point the policy no longer needed me to defend it. Residents defended it themselves, dozens of them, describing encounters that had never made the news, never had a commissioner's face attached to them, never resulted in any accountability at all until this framework existed to require it. That, more than the reprimands or the termination or even the settlement, was the outcome I'd been working toward from the very beginning. Not justice for one incident in one driveway. A structure sturdy enough that the next person it happened to, someone without a badge, without a captain who happened to know her face, would still get the same verification, the same restraint, the same accountability I received almost by accident. I think about Sawyer sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with the kind of clinical clarity I've learned to hold on to in this job. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had never once, in 8 years, been required to slow down and verify before acting on an assumption. The system had never asked that of him, so he'd never developed the habit of asking it of himself. That's not an excuse. It's a diagnosis. And diagnoses, unlike excuses, can actually be treated. I signed the final policy package on a Tuesday morning in my office, the watch resting against my wrist the way it always does. Marcus's old service number engraved so faintly on the back that most people never notice it's there at all. I noticed. I always notice. Outside my window, the city moved the way it always does. Ordinary, unremarkable, full of people going about mornings nobody was watching closely enough to record. That's exactly how it should be. Accountability isn't supposed to depend on an audience. It's supposed to exist quietly, structurally, whether or not anyone important happens to be standing in the driveway that day. I think, finally, we built something closer to that. It didn't undo what happened to me. Nothing could. But it meant the next Dorothy Vance, the one without a badge or a title or a captain who happened to recognize her face, would have something sturdier standing between her and a bad morning than sheer luck. That was always supposed to be the entire point of the job. On the 1-year anniversary of that morning, I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't issue a statement. I walked out into my own driveway before sunrise, the way I do most mornings now, and knelt down in the same spot where my glove had fallen a year earlier. The hydrangeas Marcus planted the spring before he died were blooming again, the way they do every year around this time, indifferent to anything that had happened around them. I've always found something quietly steadying in that. The world keeps growing things regardless of what we do to each other in the spaces between. Ruth came out onto her porch a few minutes later, coffee in hand, and simply stood there with me in silence for a while, the way old friends do when a moment doesn't need narrating. Feels different now, she said eventually. The street, I mean. Good different or quiet different? I asked. She thought about that longer than I expected. Both, I think. Quieter because nothing like that's happened again. Different because everyone on this block finally understands what they're allowed to say something about. I nodded. That was, more than any policy number or reprimand filed, the outcome I actually wanted. Not just an institution that behaved better under review. A neighborhood that understood its own voice mattered before an institution ever had to be forced to listen. I never fully forgave Sawyer, and I've stopped pretending that forgiveness was ever the goal. What I found instead was something steadier, a kind of clear-eyed peace with exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it ultimately built in its place. Peace was never the absence of what he did to me. It was what I chose to construct out of the 20 minutes it took him to be wrong about who I was. Marcus's watch caught the first real light of sunrise as I stood back up, brushing dirt from my knees the same way I always did on ordinary Saturday mornings. Long before any of this happened. Long before a badge or a title changed anything about the woman actually wearing it. I walked back inside, made coffee, and got ready for a job that, on most days now, looks a great deal more like the department Marcus always believed this city deserved. It took one bad morning in my own driveway to get here. I like to think he would have found that fitting. In the particular quiet way he found most hard truths fitting. Not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the steady, unsurprised calm of someone who always knew the truth eventually finds its way into the light, on its own schedule, whether anyone important happens to be watching or not. I still visit the academy twice a year to speak with incoming recruits, always on the same day, always with the same opening line. I want to tell you about a morning I spent as an ordinary resident of this city before any of you knew my name. I tell them about the driveway. I tell them about the glove on the pavement, the watch on my wrist, the 4 officers who responded, and the 3 different ways they each chose to handle a moment that demanded exactly one kind of restraint. I tell them about Ruth, and the phone she raised before she had any idea it would matter to anyone beyond her own front porch. I don't tell it to shame the department that trained them. I tell it because every recruit sitting in that room is going to have their own version of that Saturday morning eventually. A moment where assumption is faster and easier than verification, where nobody important seems to be watching, where the choice they make in under 10 seconds will end up mattering more than almost anything else they do that year. I want them to choose differently than Sawyer did. Not because I was eventually revealed to be someone powerful. Because the woman standing in that driveway deserved the same restraint whether she turned out to be a commissioner or exactly who she appeared to be that morning. An ordinary resident, gardening gloves on, standing on her own property, owed nothing more or less than basic human decency and a badge that lived up to what it was supposed to mean. Some of them ask, every single cohort, whether I regret the anonymity, whether knowing what it cost me, I'd choose the same 3 weeks again. I always answer the same way. Yes, immediately, and without hesitation. Because the version of this department that exists today, the verification standard, the duty to intervene reform, the civilian oversight structure that answers to residents instead of protecting itself from them, none of it would exist as quickly or as thoroughly if I hadn't spent those 3 weeks learning exactly what this city's police force did when it believed no one important was watching. It took a shove in my own driveway to show me the truth clearly enough to fix it. I would trade that discomfort again, every time, for a department that finally treats every resident the way it should have been treating all of them from the very beginning. That's the job. Not the title, not the office, not even the watch on my wrist. Just the promise, kept, whether or not anyone's watching. Captain Reyes sent me a letter after he retired, handwritten, which surprised me. He'd always struck me as a man who communicated exclusively through incident reports and department memos. In it, he wrote that the driveway had taught him more about 30 years of quiet institutional failure than any training course he'd ever sat through, and that he was sorry it had taken my face, specifically, for him to finally see it clearly. I wrote back and told him what I've come to believe more firmly with every year in this office, that seeing it clearly, even late, even imperfectly, still counts for something. Institutions don't change because every person inside them arrives already enlightened. They change because enough people, eventually, choose to look honestly at what they've been protecting without quite realizing it, and decide to build something better instead. Ruth passed away 2 winters after that morning, peacefully, in her sleep, in the same house she'd lived in for 30 years before either of us knew what her front porch would end up meaning to a city neither of us fully understood yet. I spoke at her memorial. I didn't talk about policy or reform. I talked about a woman who said a name out loud before she had any idea it would matter, simply because she knew, without needing convincing, that what she was watching was wrong. I think about that distinction often, the difference between people who wait to act until they're certain it's safe, and people who act because the wrongness in front of them is reason enough. Ruth belonged entirely to the second category. So, I hope, does the department I've spent years trying to reshape in her honor as much as Marcus's. The 2 backup officers from that morning both still serve. One of them was promoted to sergeant last year, largely on the strength of a service record built, in no small part, on the instinct he developed to intervene rather than stay quiet. An instinct that began, by his own admission, on the worst morning of his early career, standing silently on my lawn. I don't know if Sawyer ever thinks about that Saturday the way the rest of us do. I've made peace with not knowing. His choices were never mine to carry, only the system that let them happen so easily for as long as it did. And that system, I can say now with real confidence, looks nothing like it used to. The watch is still on my wrist as I write this. It always will be. Some mornings still start exactly the way that one did. Gardening gloves, quiet street, nobody important watching. They just don't end the same way anymore. People ask me now what I want this story to mean. Once the policy reports are filed and the training modules updated and the news cycle has long since moved on to something else entirely. I've thought about that question more than almost any other in this job. I don't want it to mean that dignity depends on eventually being recognized as powerful. It doesn't, and it shouldn't have to. I want it to mean that the ordinary version of me, gardening gloves, worn cardigan, no title anyone could see, deserved exactly the same restraint, the same verification, the same basic decency that finally arrived only once a captain happened to know my face. That gap, Between what I was owed as a resident and what I only received once my title became visible, is the entire reason I've spent every day since building policy sturdy enough to close it for the next person standing in a driveway that isn't mine. I still garden most Saturday mornings, the same hour, the same spot near the hydrangeas Marcus planted years ago. I still wear this watch every single day, not as a wound I keep reopening, but as a measurement, a reminder of exactly what the job is supposed to look like when it's done the way he always believed it should be. Sawyer is gone from this department, and eventually, in the particular way institutions eventually forget individual names, so will the specifics of that Saturday morning. What I hope survives long after both of us are footnotes is the structure it left behind. The verification standard, the intervention requirement, the oversight board that answers to residents instead of shielding itself from them. Ruth isn't here to see how far it's grown, but I think she'd recognize the shape of it. She always did have a gift for seeing exactly what was true, long before anyone handed her permission to say so out loud. I don't carry anger about that morning anymore. I carry something steadier, the quiet, settled understanding that dignity was never actually mine to reclaim. It was mine the entire time, standing in that driveway, gloves on, unrecognized, exactly as worthy of respect as I am standing here now in this uniform. The badge never gave me that. It only made other people finally see what had been true all along. That's the part of this job I hope outlives me the longest. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dramatic story. Tap like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.